Hi, I'm Lara Green and I teach modern European history here in Durham with a special focus on the history of Russia and the Soviet Union. As historians, one of the key skills you'll gain is working closely with primary sources. Historians use all different kinds of primary sources in their work, and this includes texts, images, objects, and films. Different kinds of sources can help us ask different kinds of research questions. But we also need to think about where we get these sources from. Many historians work with documents stored in archives, and it's important to think about what has been selected to be archived and how information in archives has been collected or produced. But access to archives, or the ability to even see the documents themselves, impacts on historians too. And the history of the Soviet Union is one area in which debates among historians have shifted as a result of access to archives. For a long time, many documents relating to the inner workings of the state and its leaders, such as Joseph Stalin, were hidden away inside Soviet state archives. Prior to the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, many archives in the Soviet Union were out of bounds to historians. If a historian did want to look in the archives, the archivist would scrutinize their research topics and research questions to determine whether or not they would actually be able to see the documents. While this didn't mean that all archival documents were out of bounds in the Soviet Union, it meant that documents on many different subjects were closed. The period of Stalin's leadership between 1928 and his death in 1953 was one area in which archives were highly restricted. Without access to the archival record, interpretations of historical events were often based on limited types of evidence. Historians who wanted to study this period were often reliant on memoirs published by defectors, memoirs which have often been seen as riddled with errors and invented testimony. Naturally, many of these memoirs were also overtly hostile towards Stalin and the Soviet regime. While memoirs can be useful for answering particular historical questions, one issue that they couldn't settle for those interested in the Stalin era was who was responsible for the murder of Kirov. Sergei Kirov was a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union who'd risen to become the leader of the party in Leningrad, which is now today once again known as St. Petersburg. The party played an important role in public and political life in the Soviet Union, and Leningrad was the second largest and a very important city of the Soviet Union. So this meant that Kirov was quite powerful and very influential. He'd also been one of the members of the party who'd been part of the October Revolution in 1917, which had led to the Soviet Union being established. So as well as being quite powerful, he was also well respected. Kirov was assassinated on the 1st of December 1934 by a rank-and-file party member from Leningrad named Leonid Nikolaev. Nikolaev shot Kirov in the local party headquarters in Leningrad. Subsequently, Nikolaev and many other party members, his associates, and his family members were found guilty of conspiring to murder Kirov and were executed. A couple of years later, the whole affair was used as one of the pretexts to arrest and try several leading figures of the party who disagreed with Stalin. These show trials with their predetermined outcomes led to the defendants being found guilty and either imprisoned or executed. Then, terror spread across the whole of the Soviet Union in the aftermath of these trials, leading to huge numbers being arrested and deported, imprisoned, or executed. For this reason, and because historians saw Kirov as having been a potential rival to Stalin for the leadership of the Soviet Union, it was commonly believed that Stalin had ordered Kirov's assassination. The murder seemed to be evidence of his thirst for power and control. So for a long time, this view predominated among historians in the West. Between the end of the Second World War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, political divisions between the Soviet Union and America became entrenched in what became known as the Cold War. While tensions never boiled over into open warfare, the threat of nuclear war was felt by all. And many Western historians of this period felt it was important to judge Soviet history according to their own political values, which were often strongly anti-Soviet. Therefore, many of their assessments of the events of Soviet history, such as the Kirov murder, were overwhelmingly negative, and their interpretations of Soviet history have become known as the totalitarian school. Historians of the totalitarian school, such as Robert Conquest, were convinced that Stalin must have ordered the Kirov assassination. It seemed logical, given their belief that Soviet society and the party to which the assassin belonged were governed by strict hierarchies and that ordinary party members and citizens were brainwashed by their leaders. And they called this system totalitarianism. Such an interpretation led to the assumption that the terror enacted on Soviet citizens through arrests, imprisonment, and executions was entirely the doing of Stalin. As a result, it was impossible to imagine that the assassin Nikolaev could have acted independently in killing Kirov. In the 1960s and 70s, however, some historians began to question the notion that Soviet society was brainwashed and under the complete control of Stalin. They became known as the revisionists. This was initially used as a pejorative term, but one which the revisionists themselves later embraced. They acknowledged the role of individual agency and administrative chaos in shaping phenomena such as the terror under Stalin's leadership. This meant that they often interpreted events differently to those historians from the totalitarian school. As it happened, many of these historians held political beliefs to the left of the political spectrum. Several argued that Stalinism and terror were not a natural conclusion of the Marxist political ideals upon which the Soviet Union had been founded in 1917. By not assuming that communism was an inherently evil ideological doctrine, it enabled them to gain a more nuanced understanding of Soviet society and to look past the simplistic judgments of their predecessors. However, this only fanned the flames of the highly contentious debates they now found themselves engaged in. Some were even accused of being apologists for mass murder by arguing that Stalin could not have been personally responsible for all of the arrests and executions carried out during the terror. Sheila Fitzpatrick, who's one of the most famous historians of this generation, even reflected later that the extremely personal and aggressive nature of these attacks encouraged her to avoid certain topics in her research. Historians of this generation, the revisionists, were very interested in using archives in their research. Despite challenges to accessing Soviet archives, many were able to carry out their research by asking questions differently and reading between the lines in the documents they were allowed to see, so as to gain an insight into the workings of the state that they couldn't explore outright. Some historians made use of archives such as records from the Soviet city of Smolensk, which had been captured by the advancing German army in the Second World War. These had finally ended up in American hands after the war's end, so were available to Western historians. While this new revisionist historical scholarship could offer a more nuanced view of Soviet society, it couldn't answer the question that obsessed many historians: who was responsible for Kirov's murder? After 1991, historians investigating all kinds of questions rushed to the newly opened archives in Moscow. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and so now many of the previously closed archives were opened. And among the files available for the first time was Stalin's own personal archive. Using this archive, a number of historians hoped to settle the debate once and for all as to whether or not Stalin had ordered Kirov's murder. They were hoping to find a smoking gun there among the pile of papers. But they didn't. In the end, access to the Soviet archives didn't help settle the question of Stalin's involvement in Kirov's murder. However, historians now generally accept that Stalin didn't order the assassination. However, archival documents have revealed that Stalin reacted to and made use of the event to destroy his rivals. In recent years, historians have turned to new questions, such as exploring the political culture and operation of power within Stalin's inner circle, and the everyday actions of Stalin's leadership, and they use some of these newly available documents to do this research. What the case of Kirov's murder shows is that a lack of access to evidence can limit the kinds of questions historians are able to answer in their research. However, it also shows that archives are not the only factor influencing the kinds of conclusions historians come to. New ideas and interpretations developing in the field of Soviet history since the revisionists began to challenge totalitarian narratives have completely changed the field, and it's still changing even now. This means that studying history, you'll be right in the middle of these ongoing debates, working with all different kinds of primary sources, reading work by many different historians, and coming to your own conclusions.